Whenever you're ready, Mariela.
Welcome everyone to the Sea Services Leadership Association. We're presenting the Joint Women's Leadership Virtual Series. First off, we want to thank all of our sponsors, Johnson & Johnson and Amazon Military, and our sponsor for today's webinar is USAA. We want to hear from you through the Zoom platform. You'll be prompted to complete some polling questions during the session, and we definitely value your participation. If you're on Zoom, you can participate in questions in the Q&A box or in the chat with the other participants. Or if you're joining us on Facebook Live, please type in your questions into the comments box and the speaker will address them as well. Disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed in this webinar are not endorsed by and do not represent the views of the Sea Services Leadership Association, SSLA, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, or other federal entities. And as a warning to everybody, this session is being recorded.
Who is USAA made for? It's made for him, a veteran who honorably served. And it's made for her. She's serving now. We also made USAA for military spouses and their kids. Become a member. Get an insurance quote today.
So my name is Major Mariela Pena. I'm on the board of directors as the Marine Corps representative, and it is my pleasure to introduce JJ Montanero, who's the relationship director and military advocacy group at USAA. Thanks for coming on with us, JJ, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Mariela. Now, they didn't tell me you were going to be back with me again after the last time you and I did this, when you were, you had a little bit of fun with me with a lot of questions and unanticipated twists and turns. So I'm just kidding. It's good to be back with you, and good to be with all of you here with us today, and those that are going to be watching at some point down the road. And so our topic today is investing, which is an interesting topic from a financial education standpoint. I think we probably all have our stories in terms of how we've gone right and gone wrong and what we've done good. But the interesting thing about investing, when we're talking to other people, typically what we hear is the good stories, the home runs. So I'm going to start off paradoxically looking at it from a little different perspective. I'm going to tell you about the first stock that I ever bought. And so I was back at West Point. Ultimately, I graduated, which was a win. I spent about 6 years on active duty in the Army, and then the rest of my time in the Army Reserve, and retired, 2009, so quite a while ago. But as soon as I got off active duty, I went into the financial world, primarily because I enjoyed it. But as I look back upon my experiences, I'm not sure why I enjoyed it or what I was doing, but I kind of created a roadmap in terms of maybe things you shouldn't do. And so some of that is painted into this particular presentation. But back to that first stock. So if you buy stocks, of course, you're buying equity in a particular company, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into it. But you've got ownership. You want to see the company do well, and of course, if the company does well, you're going to do well and you're going to make money. And so this was back at a time, to date myself, before there was online trading and before there was a lot of the access and the information that we have today. So I was in a econ class, and I had a professor, and this was by 1987, so fall of 1987. And at that point in time, the market was a bull market. Everything was going up. You could pretty much throw a dart at the Wall Street Journal and hit a stock that was going to be a winner. But anyway, this professor, and I'm not sure why he did this. This was probably counter to all rules, but for whatever reason, he planted the seed that this company called Crazy Eddie was a great place to invest. So maybe he did it inadvertently, but me and a few of my buddies, we thought, hey, this is a great idea. So we pooled our money together. Again, at that time, we had to send the money to my dad, who bought the stock in a brokerage account. And so there was my first stock, Crazy Eddie. And this was about August, and probably 2 or 3 weeks later, that stock had gone from like $8 up to $13. and then up to $15. And at that point in time, I was pretty much thinking to myself, I'm not sure about this Army gig. I probably could just do the stock picking for the rest of my life and make a pretty good living. But that's not how the story ended. So if anybody knows any history, Black Monday, October of '87, that was the year. And so we hit that. The market across the board just tanked. At the time, it was the biggest drop the market had ever had. Our stock went back from 15 or whatever it was at that time, back down to about 7 or 8. And I realized, well, maybe this is not as easy as it first seemed. Then things got worse because ultimately, apparently, Crazy Eddie was a bit of a crook. So you can look this up in the history books. I've actually gone back and looked, but it was a guy named Eddie Antar, and he was running kind of a scheme. Ultimately, he fled the country. He was under investigation by the FBI. The company went bankrupt, and when a company goes bankrupt, all your stock, all your value is gone. And so that was my first foray into the world of investing, and it wasn't a very good one, but it didn't keep me from plugging away. And so our hope today is to have a good conversation with you. If you have questions, ask them in the chat box. And we're going to talk about a little bit about investing in terms of putting together a portfolio, what are investments, what are the different accounts that are available, and ultimately, no crystal ball here, not going to tell you what's going to do good next year, next week, but hopefully going to give you some ideas about fundamentally, foundationally putting together a plan that's going to serve you well. Mariella, anything you want to hit before we start rolling?
The first question that I had is, if I have some money to invest, but I also have some debt, should I pay off my debt first before I start investing, or should I just start now?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't have it on this particular slide deck, but sometimes when I'm talking about this particular subject, what I'll do is I'll get a slide of a table setting, beautiful, pristine, as we're getting ready to have Thanksgiving. I wish everybody had a great Thanksgiving, but as we're getting ready to do that, this is a good time, and you can envision the crystal and the plate, the china, and everything, and my point of behind that slide is simply that if we wait until everything is perfect to start investing, we probably won't ever start, because there's always something, there's always a reason not to. And I guess one of my points today is to find a reason to invest, because what you have more now than you'll have 10 years from now is 10 years of time. And what you have, probably most of the folks out here watching this have more than I do, is time. So you want to leverage that time, and that's time compound returns. So to answer your question in kind of a roundabout way, I would say maybe, if I had high interest credit card debt, it would be hard for me to get fired up if I'm paying 20% on a credit card about taking money and putting in investments. On the other hand, maybe I'm covered by the blended retirement system, and if I put money in, if I put 5% in, I'm going to get a total of 5% from the Navy or from my service, and that's an opportunity I don't want to miss out on. So maybe there's some middle ground there, but I definitely think it kind of depends on the type of debt, Mariella, and but also I don't know that I would wait until I got everything, the slate totally clean before I started investing. In fact, I know I wouldn't wait. Does that answer the question?
Yes, perfect. So start right away.
Start right away. My boss is an admiral, a retired admiral, and so he this was probably 10 years ago, still my boss today, but we were at one of the academies talking, and he got up and he was talking to the students or the cadets, and he said, hey, when's the best time to invest? Was one of my themes, was that start early. But he was like using the ancient Chinese proverb, and he said, the best time to invest sure was 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 30 years ago, but the second best time is now. And so that would certainly be one of the calls to action out of our discussion today, is if this isn't something you're doing that's part of your plan, we want to see you get to that point where it is. All right, let's go to the next slide. Or is the next slide mine? Yeah, disclosures. You can come back, you can freeze frame that and watch it later. But the bottom line is, this is just an informational presentation. And as Mariella said right up front, this is not information that's being endorsed. There's no endorsement here, implied or otherwise. All right, next slide. Now the interesting thing about the world of investments, and I think it's there's been a pretty good transition over the time frame that I've been working in this space in terms of access and accessibility and information, because it used to be if you wanted to trade a stock, for example, you'd have to go to a stockbroker, and if you traded 100 shares of stock, it might cost you, $500 or $600 to do that transaction. And today you can do that transaction for virtually free. But one of the things that is still a little bit confusing is just the fact that there's all these acronyms. So I always joked when I first got into the investment world, it was the only place I could find that there's as many acronyms here that there are in the military. So you ought to be somewhat comfortable with them, but the acronyms are different. So whether it's TSP, something you're familiar with, maybe ETF, TSA, all these things, they're not that difficult, and you don't want them to put you off from taking the next step, because sometimes it can be intimidating when you start seeing all these terms you don't understand. And so that's our goal today, is really to drill down into the basics and get beyond that wall that sometimes is put up by the investment world, if you will. All right, next slide. Here's our agenda. Now, as a financial planner, next slide. As a financial planner, of course, I would tell you that, and I already talked about the importance of time and compounding returns, but that is certainly the one thing we can't get back. And so as I look at my baby, if you will, my baby is graduating from nursing school next May, so she'll be out of the house. And I can always remember people telling me, "Oh, time will fly," and really value all the time that you have with your daughter or your kids. And I would kind of, yeah, whatever, I'd roll my eyes. But the reality is it does fly, and it goes fast. And a few small steps today can make a big difference down the road, but you've got to take those steps. And time is, we can't go back and get more of that. Certainly money in various ways is obtainable, but time and the power it possesses is not. Next slide. All right, so to that point, time, I can't tell anybody on this call, hey, what's the right investment for you? But I can tell everybody here that the investment or the savings vehicle or whatever it is you choose should really reflect the goal for which you're putting that money away. And so if I'm putting money in an emergency fund, for example, that's going to be a savings account. And you may say to me, hey, JJ, I'm earning 0.01% on my savings account, and I feel like I'm getting robbed every time I put money in that account. But the reality is, hey, that purpose is a purpose for which you want all the money there whenever you need to access it. So you want it liquid, safe, and accessible. And the trade-off is, at least in today's interest rate environment, with everything that's going on with the pandemic and the Fed, you're not going to earn a lot of money there. On the other hand, if you're going out for something that's 30 or 40 years down the road, then, hey, it pretty much opens up the whole portfolio of options out there. And so you can build a portfolio that fits your time horizon, but also your risk tolerances, your tax preferences, and what have you. So again, what's the right place to invest? I don't know, but I do know that time should be a critical element in what your selection is. For some of us, college education it's in the rearview mirror, almost, for me. But on the other hand, what are your goals? And so have you got those goals? Have you built that plan? Because that should be the driver of what you do and don't do, whether it's how much you save, where you save, and how you do it. All right, next slide. This is the, I'll talk about this in a couple different ways, but the old risk return, and I'll put the word potential in there when we talk about risk or return, because the return goes up as the risk goes up, but it's potential. Like you see commodities up there at the top in terms of most risk, most potential return, but at least over the last decade or so, that hasn't been the case. There's certainly been risk there, but there hasn't been much of a return. But that doesn't really the past performance, it doesn't dictate future performance for sure, but you have to understand that relationship. So when I say time is important and you shouldn't put stocks in the money that you're going to pay the mortgage with 2 months from now, the reason is because, yeah, it could go up and you could have more money and be able to put more money off to the side and still pay your mortgage. On the other hand, you could put your $2,000 in there for the mortgage, and end up with $1,500 because bad things happen in the market. So there's two elements to that. One is just the basic risk, and it is real. If you just reflect back to where were you back at the beginning of this year when the market tanked, that feeling of loss, excuse me, and seeing your portfolio go down is not some intangible idea or concept. It's very real. The other element that you have to figure out is, okay, from the standpoint of how much can I endure? How much can my situation endure? We have that idea of risk capacity. So as somebody who's in the working force, has a stream of income, the fact that my portfolio goes down is not going to have as much of an impact on me as, let's say, somebody who's a retiree and relying on that portfolio to create the income, and they have nowhere else to turn. I was talking to my my stepdad, who's 90, and I was telling him to relax. It's going to be okay. And that's exactly what he told me. He said, "Hey, thanks for your input, but I have nowhere else to turn. I've got Social Security in this portfolio that I've built, and so my risk capacity," he didn't say these words, but my risk capacity is much less than yours, who you're still working and have a stream of income. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, JJ. But when
now
you're
see,
talking risk,
that's an eraser word. It makes perfect sense, but go ahead.
yes. Well,
This is why I'm here, Mariella.
well, for the risk capacity, are you talking about time also? Is that what you mean by risk capacity? Is how much of a loss can I take in a certain period of time?
Well, so time could certainly play a factor in that, because if my time frame was short for whatever we're talking about, then my capacity for loss in that particular situation would be very low. So my capacity for loss with respect to my emergency fund, for example, would be zero, because I can't have that money shrinking in value because I need it all there. So yeah, that's fair.
Got it.
Cool. All right, next slide. So manage and monitor your plans. Again, everything hinging off that plan. The plan provides an anchor in terms of what you're doing and the decisions you make and the savings and investment program that you have. You ought to be committed to that plan. You ought to anticipate, at least on the longer term stuff where you're picking vehicles that have that potential for loss, that there's going to be losses. And ultimately, I think one of the key messages we've seen throughout the last year, but not just really the last year, if you look at any time, the Great Recession, the boomer, the tech boomer bust, is that you've got to be able to manage your emotions, because it's easy for us to sit here and say, it's going to be okay. But the reality is if it's not going to be okay for you in the near term, you're going to do something. And if that something is counterproductive, that's a bad thing. And the story I usually tell with respect to this had to do with a lottery winner that I worked with, who this was in the midst of the Great Recession. So the market was going down. It was at the end of 2008, and their portfolio was shrinking. And I was telling them, hey, we still have 20 or 30 years till you're going to use this money. It doesn't really matter, but it did matter to them. And ultimately, I met with him in February of 2009, and then again in June. And in between there, the market did a remarkable turnaround. So I think it went up 30 or 40% in that little small window of time. And when I got ready to meet with him in June, I was like, okay, can't wait to pat myself on the back and pat them on the back for sticking through it and not letting those emotions drive them to a bad decision. Well, when I pulled up I saw their appointment on my calendar, I pulled up their portfolio, and it was all in the money market fund. So they had literally at the bottom of the market, I believe it was like March 8th of 2009, they had pulled everything out. And so timing, emotions, again, really counterproductive in that particular situation. And it was, as much my fault as theirs, because I was the one trying to steer them to the right place and build that portfolio. But apparently, I obviously didn't do it in a great way. The one thing you don't want to do though is stick your head in the sand. So I have on here periodic review, make adjustments. So just because I'm saying don't make emotional decisions doesn't mean you're not watching your portfolio, you're not rebalancing it, you're not reallocating it if things change. So those type of things are still things that you do. They're part of your plan, and they're part of what I call that first bucket, that bucket that we can control. I think in the last session we did, I talked about my kids, and the idea that I tried to ingrain in them was just that, hey, there are things you can control. That's where you should focus all your energy. There's things you can influence, maybe focus a little bit there. And then there's stuff that you can neither influence nor control. Don't spend any of your emotions, your energy on that area. And with investments, hey, rebalancing my portfolio, looking at my plan, making adjustments to the assumptions I've made, that's all stuff you can control. And that's all great to do as you're looking at the world going on around you in a crazy, crazy way. All right. I think we have our first poll question here. Is that right? Yeah. Julia? Yes, we do. All right. So we crafted this question, and you have to give us an honest answer. We're not going to track you down and try to figure out where you're at and what's wrong and call you names. But have you ever let what's going on day to day? And we've had a lot of that recently. Has that ever driven you to make adjustments in your portfolio? So the idea, of course, is that shouldn't be something that's driving you. Mariella, how about you? See, now I'm gonna put it back on you.
Well, I have a most recent example in January when the markets tanked. Then I had everything in my TSP fund, in the C fund, almost everything. And then I'm going to retire probably in about 10, 15 years. I still have a long ways to go, hopefully. And when the market tanked, I put everything back into the bond fund for my TSP. And then I missed out on that rebound during the summer. And then so when I put my money back into the C fund, it was 100%. I had missed all the gains for the year. And so now I'm at a worse situation than I was before. And it was the first time that I've made like that emotional decision. And I learned from it, that's for sure.
Yeah. So next time I tell that story, I'm going to include you. So you're going to be the story. I won't use your name, but you'll be the
Yes.
You'll be the story. But
I
that's
didn't
great.
do it for 2008, but I did it most recently in 2020.
Well,
I kept my cool in 2008.
it's been a crazy year, so that's understandable. But what's interesting about that too is that when you from my perspective, so you've got 10 or 15 years until you retire from the Marine Corps, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, but you really got another 30 or 40 years or 50 years until you really retire from the workforce. So you have more time than just that. So in either case, you've got plenty of time not to make those sorts of decisions. But I'm not saying it's easy. So let's see what people said. We have kind of a small crew, a third. What portfolio? So what portfolio? If you answered that, then our call to action today for you is to the next time that you do something like this, you have some sort of portfolio. We have one rock that said stayed the course. We had an interesting, so Charles Schwab is a partner of USAA's, and they shared with us some a survey. They have a modern retirement survey series, if you will, and they shared some of the results from the veteran slice of it, and it was pretty interesting because the veteran slice was much more resilient, I guess I would say, than the general population in terms of making moves to respond to what was happening. So don't let that be the case. And again, one of the ways to insulate yourself from that is to make sure that you're aware of the time factor that we just talked about. And unlike Mariella, you recognize the time, but you also give it time to work. How's that? Now she's gonna come after me with the crazy question.
Yeah, I learned my lesson, that's for sure.
Good stuff. All right, next slide. So why do we invest? Well, we invest for income or profit of some sort, right? One of the things that one of the reasons that we invest is just the idea that, hey, there's rising prices, there's inflation, and maybe not a lot of it today, but again, if you go back over time, even the last 30 years, which I like to look at because I go back to my West Point graduation date and say, okay, what if I had $1 million? What kind of purchasing power would I have today? And even in this last 30 years, which hasn't really been that inflation hasn't been that notable for inflation, I would have lost 60% of my purchasing power over the last 30 years. So I could buy less with $1 million today than I could 30 years ago. And so that's one of the reasons that we want to invest is to make sure we outpace inflation. But we are investing with a purpose. It's not just it's an end. And the end is, it's not an end in itself. The end is the goals that we're trying to achieve. All right, so let's look at these building blocks. Next slide. Let's look at the investments here. And again, so I talked about my first stock purchase. That the stock represents equity ownership in some company. One of the things that we try to do with our kids is really instill this in them. And I have to give my brother, who's a Navy veteran, I have to give him credit for this. But what he did is when they were relatively young, probably 5 or 6 years old, what he did is started buying them stock certificates. So he said, hey, I'm going to buy you a few shares of stocks, and he would have different themes each year. It might be tech, or it would be banks, or whatever it was. And then when they got to be 18, he actually gave them the money. So it was a pretty good lesson in terms of compounding returns, because it was big chunks of money by the time they actually got there. But it also gave them a sense of what it is to own a stock. So they would go into the Apple store, for example, and say like, that little tile over there, that's mine. I own that tile. So they knew that they owned a little piece of that company. So stocks represent ownership. Bonds, on the other hand, you're essentially the lender. You're going to lend some institution. If it's a government bond, you're going to lend the government money. In return, they're going to pay you interest. Now, that's greatly simplifying how it works, but that's essentially what it is. And so the less reliable it is that they're going to pay you that interest. So a startup gas station on the corner with not good prospects is going to have to pay a lot more interest to you to borrow the money from you. And there's, again, the possibility that they could default on that and not be able to pay you, and you'd lose your money. Whereas with a government bond, it's a pretty safe bet that they're going to pay that interest, and so they're going to pay less interest, but at the end of the period, they're going to give you your principal back. So that's again a simplified example of how bonds work. One, you're a lender. One, you're an equity owner. And then, of course, everybody's familiar with cash and CDs. Commodities would be things like gold, oil, wheat, corn, that sort of thing. So those are examples of the different types of building blocks. Pretty rarely do we go out and buy those individually, other than like the cash and CDs. Most of the time, we're going to use some vehicles to get there. All right, next slide. Just like we talked about up front with our plan, when you look at the different opportunities out there, they run the spectrum from low potential return and a lot of safety and stability to, on the other end of the spectrum, higher potential return, but also real risk of losing and loss. So there's a trade-off there, and you have to understand that. And again, to me, I think time is a key element in how you manage that risk. Let's look at some examples. Next slide. Well, I'm having some great. All right, so here,
JJ,
yeah.
If you've sold me and I have to start investing, then how do I pick a company to start investing with?
So when you look at if we look at our slide here, we've got companies. So you're talking about stocks. So we've got small, medium, and large companies. We've got companies inside the U.S. and outside the U.S. We've got emerging market companies. So companies in economies that are just starting to really get on the roll. And so I think that, to me, we're going to talk about that in a second, but I think you don't try to pick a particular company. So I think you take a different route, and go a little bit broader. So let me, don't steal my thunder yet. Let me kind
Okay.
of get there. All right, let's
Okay.
go to the next slide. So this is to your question, how do you buy them? Well, you could buy them individually. You could open up a brokerage account, or you could invest directly in a company that has a direct stock program. Or I think what most people do, and probably makes sense for most people, is using some sort of vehicle to do that. So it could be a mutual fund, which have been around for decades, where you have a professional manager and a portfolio, various people. You put your money in the mutual fund, and that professional manager buys stocks in accordance with the prospectus or the rules that follows. And so that's a way for you to get access to, take a little bit of money and get access to in a lot of cases, a lot of different stocks. Exchange traded funds are a basket of stocks as well, or basket of investments. The same, works kind of the same way, except for they trade during the day. Typically, historically, when they started out, they were just indexes like the S&P 500. But today they're a lot more complex than that. But again, it's a basket of stocks, and just because you have 5 different mutual funds or exchange traded funds, that doesn't necessarily mean you're diversified. One of the things that we talk about and are going to talk about here in a few minutes is just the idea of not having all your eggs in one basket and being diversified among various different types of investments. And the number of mutual funds you have does not really dictate whether or not you're diversified. I would have people come into my office with 15 different mutual fund statements, and every one of them was investing in large company growth stocks. So they had a lot of overlap. And even though they felt diversified because they have a number of different investments, they weren't really. So anyway, you can buy things individually or as a part of a package. Managed accounts, I'm just going to use that as, that's a broad term. I'm going to use it for any sort of tool that you use to get access to a portfolio. So it could be in the TSP. So Mary Ellie, have you used the life cycle funds or not?
Yes. Yeah, I had it in life cycle funds for a little while, and then I didn't really understand it, so I just took my money out and put it in the C fund.
Okay, so the C fund, so with the life cycle funds, you have a little, they professionally develop a portfolio based on the age that you're going to retire. And that portfolio is made up of the building block funds like the C fund or the S or the I. But with and so those type of things exist in the TSP, but they also exist in mutual fund companies. There's also a variety of robo-advisor type accounts or services where you can put, $100 in or $10 in, and it's built into a portfolio of different sizes of companies, different types of companies in and out of the US. And so that's kind of what I would call managed. That's what I'm calling managed accounts here. Used to be that you pay a big fee and somebody would build a portfolio for you. But my idea here is that this is just some sort of way for you to get access to a diversified portfolio. And there's, again, a lot more ways today than there used to be to be able to do that. All right, next slide. Oh, hold on a second. We got a poll, don't we? So let's ask our crowd here of participants, which of these have you used? And again, I don't think there's a right answer in terms of what makes sense, but I think they're all valid options. So we can see. So Mariella, you didn't, so do you understand the life cycle funds now?
I do. So you can click on if you're going to retire in 20 years and 30 years. So then if I hit on like the 2040 lifestyle fund or life cycle fund, then that means it'll get more conservative as it gets closer to 2040.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And even at 2040, it's still going to have so the idea being is that as you get closer to that retirement date, and that would be, again, not your retire from the military date, it should be your retire from the workforce date. As you get closer to that date,
Okay.
then the portfolio is going to get more conservative, because the idea being that once we get there, I want to have less volatility and less potential for loss than I do when I'm 25 and I still have 30 or 40 years to go before that. So I think the two thing, yeah. So I think it's a pretty handy way to do it for folks that don't have the time or inclination or expertise to mess around with the different building block funds. All right, so what did we find out, Julia? What do we get for our responses here? All, I like that. That's good. So again, great options. There are other ways to do it. You can go out there and buy individual stocks. I think so this number is, if you look at stocks are fair or exchange traded funds, I can buy one and have literally 5,000 different stocks in. So I take my $100 and I have a little piece of all those different stocks. Bonds really lend themselves well to this because it's a little bit harder for me to go out and buy a diversified portfolio, which I might be able to do with 15 or 20 stocks, which still would require some money with bonds. And so bonds, mutual funds or exchange traded funds certainly make bonds more accessible, and they're an important building block in terms of our portfolios. All right, next slide. So now we're going to shift. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to shift gears and circle back to something that we've talked about, and that's okay. I know I can buy these different types of investments. I can buy them in wrappers that allow me to through mutual funds or exchange traded funds, buy and build a diversified portfolio. Now I want to put together a portfolio, and again, I'm going to go back to the goal piece, because you may have money that's set aside for a short-term portfolio, medium term, and long term. And so I would define that as short term would be probably 0 to 3 years, medium term 4 to 10, and then long term 10 plus. That's a ballpark of how you would break that down. But you probably have goals that fit in all those different categories. And so as you build the portfolio targeted for those goals, it's going to be different. It's going to be different in terms of construction, in terms of the accounts you choose, which we'll talk about in a second, but also in terms of the tax treatment. So I may invest a certain way to take advantage of the tax benefits and available in certain plans, and that may drive how I build my portfolio. But in terms of guiding principles, we talked about the importance of time, the importance of not investing everything in a specific area, and that's hard to do when you watch what happens. It's hard right now not to say, hey, you know what, I should be in just those big tech companies because they're driving the market. And so inevitably what has happened historically is, if you go back and look, the performance rotates. So while the growth oriented companies right now are doing really well, I don't know when it's going to be, but at some point in time, they'll rotate and they won't be doing so well. And then those type of value type stocks that have done really poorly relatively recently will start to do well. So it's hard to take last year's results, and you shouldn't, and use that as a dictator of what I'm going to do this year. And again, we already talked about risk and the fact that hollow feeling in your stomach could cause you, Mariella, to do something maybe that's not in your best interest ultimately.
Yes, I know that feeling.
All right, next slide. All right, I think we really drilled this one. So hopefully everybody's got that, but it's just the idea of the goal drives the options. And do you have to take advantage? If you have retirement in 40 years, does that mean you need to be in emerging market stocks? No, but it means that's something that's open to you to choose. It's a legitimate choice that you might make as part of your portfolio, and you can be as conservative as you want. Sometimes I'll get into a discussion with folks and they'll be like, well, you know what? I don't want to do stocks. I've been through the Great Recession. I saw what happened at the beginning of this year. I don't need that in my life. And that's okay. You just have to make sure that your plans accommodate that. So maybe all you do is inflation protected securities. That's the portfolio you want to build, or something that's cash oriented. You're just going to have to save a lot more to account for that inflation that we were talking about earlier. Next slide. All right, so here's the account piece. So we've talked the building blocks, the investments. We've talked about portfolio. Now let's talk about some of the specific accounts. And this is what everybody is probably familiar with, but it's interesting because I hear, because people characterize it a little bit different than we've done today. So next slide. So this makes sense to me, Mariella. You tell me if it makes sense to you. I know you looked at the slide before, but to me, when you look at investment accounts, what you're talking about is a garage. So the account is a garage. What you put in it is the vehicle that you put in it would be the portfolio or the stocks, the bonds, the mutual funds. So the result that you get in terms of investment results is going to be based on the car or the vehicle in the garage. How it's treated for tax and other purposes would be a function of the type of account that you put it in. So when someone says, hey, my IRA earns 7%, technically your IRA is not an investment. It's an account, and it dictates how the tax, how it's taxed, or if you're tax deferred, or is it going to be a Roth and ultimately be tax free, as opposed to an investment. So does that make sense? To me, it really makes sense. And then I'll talk to people and they'll just kind of stare at me like, what are you talking about? So
Well, I mean, I like the picture because now I can see, okay, so the garage is the actual holding space. And then the vehicle is either a retirement account or something, a savings account for college, or if I want to save up for a house, that would be the vehicle. Is that right?
So I explained it exactly wrong. That's what I did today. So I've been working at this for a long time and I failed yet again. So the garage is the account. So it could be special treatment with respect to college savings. It could be a retirement account that has special benefits and protections for when it comes to income taxes. And the vehicle is the stock that I bought to put in my IRA, for example. So I could have a Ford Pinto in there that's not going very fast and not doing very well, or I could have a Ferrari that can go very fast but can also crash. And that's going to be, when I say I earn 24% in my IRA portfolio, it's going to be a function of whatever I put in that garage. But the fact that it wasn't taxed, it was tax deferred, was part of the garage. So I may have to go back. I may have to go back to the drawing board on this one. I don't know. I thought it was.
Okay.
It made sense to me. One of those things. You guys, anybody? Does that make sense to anybody? Let's hear in the chat box here. I'm going to pop open that chat box. So we're going to do a drawing, and we're going to do a drawing at the end here. So somebody's going to be a winner. But I want to. It doesn't look like anybody wants to chat either.
No, we don't have anyone on the chat room yet.
Okay. All right. Anyway, so that was an explanation that made sense to me, but there are different types of accounts that provide you different benefits depending on what your goal is. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here are an example, for example, of retirement accounts. So these are retirement garages, Mariella. That's what I'm going to call them from now on. So you have the TSP, or of course, which is the government or the military's version of a 401k. And those are employer plans where you do payroll deduction into the plan. You can put a lot of money in there, nearly 20,000, and get those special tax advantages. So the tax advantages could be Roth, which means generally speaking, you get no tax benefit for doing it today, but you don't pay tax as it grows on the income, the dividends, the interest. And then on the back end, everything you pull out, both what you put in and all the investment earnings, all come out tax-free if you meet certain hurdles, if you will, 50 age and time of having the account. So these type of accounts are fantastic. They're really an incentive for us to save for retirement because they're going to make it better. Now, what is better? The question I often get is, hey, is Roth better or is traditional better? And that's one of those, it depends type questions, because similar to picking the right investment that's going to do well over the next 6 years or 6 months, picking the right type of retirement account has got similar perils because we don't know for certain whether you're going to be paying more taxes in the future or less tax. You can make an educated guess based on where you're at income wise. Somebody who is just starting out in the workforce or just joined the military probably is going to make more money and thus pay more taxes as they get older. And so then maybe Roth might make sense for them, but we don't know for certain that's going to be the case. So one of the things that you can do is just this idea of tax diversification. So using a little bit of the different vehicles so that you get current tax benefits like you get with a traditional TSP by reducing your taxes today or your taxable income today. You also do some Roth where you know on the back end it's going to be very beneficial because you have the potential for tax-free income. And then you do some currently taxable type investments where you pay as you go. They show up on your tax return each year because they have unfettered access, unlike these retirement accounts that you essentially, while there are exceptions, you generally have to leave them there till 59 and a half to reap all those tax benefits. So these are great types of vehicles if the goal for what you're doing is retirement. Did that make sense? Mariella, you're my truth diviner.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that makes sense.
All right. All right, let's go to the next one. So college accounts, again, if the goal is college, the garage I might want to put it into is a 529 college savings plan or a Coverdell education savings account. And so when you're saving for those specific goals, these accounts offer advantages. And they might be, for example, tax advantages, essentially the money that you put in here and all the growth, if you pull it out for qualified education expenses, you're going to pull it out tax-free. So that's a huge benefit for when it comes to saving for college, especially if in conjunction with maybe you have the post 9/11 GI Bill, but you have multiple kids. So it still makes sense to use one of these vehicles if your goal is to help them graduate without a big debt burden. But these specific vehicles are designed for that specific goal and are, again, great ways to do that. All right, next slide. There are other type of accounts out there. If you're saving for a minor, let's say your grandparents gave your kid $100 and you wanted to set up some sort of a account for them, you would set it up in a uniform, depending on the state, uniform transfer to minors account registration. So you would be you as the custodian for your child, but it's truly their money as opposed to yours. And ultimately, when they get to be whatever the age of majority is, it is their money. I can remember having a parent that was really upset because the child was 23 at that time, and they were trying to go in there and make adjustments. And they're like, man, my mutual fund company wouldn't listen to what I was telling them to do. And I'm like, well, that's because once that child hit the age of majority, it was no longer you as the custodian, it was their money. So that's a good way to set up accounts for kids. Of course, savings bonds. I don't know if anybody uses savings bonds, but at some point, I've always been a fan of the I bonds. So those are inflation. The return you get on them is tied in part to inflation. Now, again, that's something we haven't seen a lot of recently, but that is, again, one of the huge risks over a long period of time when it comes to putting your money in savings types vehicles, because you'll lose that purchasing power. With the I bond, it's designed to protect you from losing that purchasing power. You've got annuities that are designed for retirement or to create retirement income streams. And then, of course, brokerage or mutual fund accounts that you can just own. So you don't have to have an IRA brokerage account. Maybe you own it jointly with your spouse, or maybe you own it individually. And as I said earlier, when I was talking about pay as you go, the dividends and the interest and the income it creates, yes, you'll pay taxes on it, but not every goal is retirement. So you may have a goal to buy a beach house, 15 years from now, but you don't want to put the money in a savings account because you want that to grow between now and that 15-year time period. So maybe you use a brokerage account and buy an exchange traded fund or a mutual fund or something like that. All right, next slide. John Miller. All right, we're going to finish up this before we get to your questions with a little bit of a discussion of things to avoid. Oh, no, we're not. We're going to do a poll first. I knew you would have to keep me straight on that. All right, so this is a question in terms of, for you personally, again, no right or wrong answer, but what's important to you when you're selecting a specific investment? Is it the return that's expected? Is it what you're hearing from your friends or family? Do you have a financial advisor, get some advice? Or is it, again, the goal that you're setting the money aside for? What drives your specific investment choice? Mariella, that's when I'm going to turn to you. I'm going to give you some runway here. So I'm going to tell you that I'm coming to you. But when you look at choosing a
Yes.
specific investment, what is it that is the key driver for you, or how do these different factors play a role?
The most important for me is the potential return and the expected rate of return. But I also got on the tech bandwagon a while back in 2005 with Facebook and Google. And so I was lucky enough that I bought some Google stock in 2005.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty. So I didn't talk about I told you about my brother and how he kind of got my kids, not kind of, he bought them. That was the present. I think maybe the first couple of years he was like buying toys and stuff. He's like, I'm done with that. I'm gonna start buying them stocks. And they really weren't not big fans of that until much later. But one of the things he bought him was Bitcoin, and at the time it was like it was some, I hadn't even heard of it. It was like $100 or something. It wasn't very big, and so that's been a good one. So there are those good stories that were for you identify trends that make a
Yes.
big difference. But most of the time, hey, if you can use those indexes and use the broad-based type approaches, that's a good approach. I like that. I like the idea of taking core investments like those life cycle funds in the TSP or broad-based index funds and using them for the bulk of what you're trying to do. So your success hinges on what happens there. And then if you've got some flyers on the outside, it doesn't really matter. If you hit a home run, that's great. But if you strike out, it doesn't matter. All right, let's look, Julie, at these poll results. Look at that. Everybody's focused on return. That's good. Now I was making the pitch today that you should also focus on the purpose of the money. So I guess specifically in terms of the investments you check, it might not matter, but it should certainly play a role in what you select because it has that time factor in there. All right, let's look at some potential pitfalls. See how we're doing time-wise, doing pretty good. All right, so not starting. So we had one of our audience, and I don't have any names, so we're not going to come after you, but one of our audience said, hey, what portfolio? Because maybe they haven't really started getting this going. So whether it's contributing to the TSP, doing a automatic purchase into a Roth IRA, sliding money into a savings account, to me, as we hopefully emphasize here today, getting started is something that you don't want to find a reason not to do. You want to find a reason to do it. And one of the ways you can really facilitate that happening is making automatic contributions, making contributions that don't require a decision. So if we wait to the end of the month to put money into our IRA, then guess what? There'll be something that comes up that doesn't allow us to make a contribution. On the other hand, if at the first of the month we pull money out of our checking account, automatically transfer it into that, then hey, we're probably going to make some headway because we don't have to make a decision. We've set ourselves up for success. We've talked about, and I think Mariella, you actually had a question on this when we were talking before we got ready. So let's circle back to that. But the idea that hey, when people talk about the TSP and it's really great, one of the things that they always talk about is the fact that it has very low expenses, which it does. Expenses are the one thing that really you have control over because we can tell what the expenses are going to be. We don't know what the performance is going to be because we don't have that crystal ball. So you want to watch expenses. You don't want to let those headlines, as we talked about, drive decisions. There's only a few levers that you can, as you get closer to a goal, you can be more aggressive, you can push back the goal, you can change the goal, whether it's retirement or saving for that beach house that we talked about. But one of the things that you want to be cautious about is thinking that, oh, okay, I can take more risk. I can go out and buy penny stocks, for example, and expect to get a big return. Well, again, the idea of risk is real. You could lose that money and maybe not achieve your goal. And too often people hop from whatever was best last year to whatever was best last year, and they're not catching it as opposed to being diversified into different type of asset classes and just periodically rebalancing or reallocating if things change in their situation. All right, I think that was our last slide. Oh, okay. This one, actually, this is a pretty good slide. So this is just another way to say time matters, compound returns matter, and little by little, a little can become a lot. So here you look at somebody who just entered the military. They just stay in for a few years. After 5 years, they've got something that seems $15,000 or so. Doesn't seem like a huge amount of time. They forget about it, just let it grow. Hey, fast forward to age 65, and they've got, just from that small effort, $151,000. So that's the whole story of time told visually. And that's the story I hope you take from this conversation today. All right. I think we're
And
going.
that's my feel good story, JJ, because when I was a Lance Corporal, my sergeant got me started, and I've been investing ever since. So
And that's what I think is really cool about anybody who's watching this, whether you're here with us or watching the video. And one of the reasons I always like coming to this particular event is because you guys are leaders, you are influencers, you make a difference. In something like this, pushing somebody down this path can make a huge difference in their life and can have a real impact. And someday, like Mariella, they'll be coming back and talking about and remembering fondly you in the fact that you said, hey, this is something you ought to do and a path you ought to go down. And I think that, to me, doing my job that I do now here on the military advocacy team at USA, that's what fires me up. Is every once in a while I'll have conversations with somebody who was at an event a few years ago or did something, and I'm like, yeah, baby, this is good. So that's a good story, Mariella.
yes. And JJ, well, we have, before you finish, we've selected a random recipient of the gift card that you mentioned.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
her name is Amy Stevens. She's joining us on Facebook Live right now.
Okay.
So Amy, congratulations on winning the gift card from USAA. So send us an email on our Sea Services Leadership website or on Facebook to give us your contact information so we can get that gift card over to you.
Yep. So all I need is if you guys will forward over to me name, phone number, address, and we will get the gift card to Amy. Good stuff. All right.
Yeah.
So I think we've got a few minutes for questions. I think I've got time. So as long as you guys do, we can do that. But I really, on behalf of everybody, are we gonna do some questions? All right. I'll save my thank you.
Yeah. So the one last question that I had is how do I select which company is my garage? Like you explained it. How do I select a company? Is there a method where I can pick what fees are the lowest? Where should I be looking to see how much companies are charging me to hold my money?
Sure. There are a lot of great resources out there in terms of finding the right investments in the right company for you. So it could be, I'll share a couple. Let's say if I was looking for a 529 college savings plan, I might go to savingforcollege.com, which allows you to look at all the different 529 plans across the country, whether it's a USA plan in Nevada or some other plan in Missouri or whatever it is, and compare expense ratios and options as far as investments. Or if you're looking at specific mutual funds or exchange traded funds, we talked about watching expenses there, and Mariella is asking about that. So you can go to morningstar.com and type in the ticker symbol or the name and do a little bit of research. And one of the facts that is in there is the expense ratio that we've talked about, whether that's an exchange traded fund or it's a mutual fund. And so what you want to do is ensure that you're not way out there in left field in terms of you're paying X amount and everybody else is paying a lot less. So the other thing though, I would point out there is, so there are people out there that make a living by providing advice. And maybe it's a fee only financial planner, where you sit down and you pay a fee and they help you develop a financial plan. or maybe it's so that's a model that works. There's other advisors that you pay a percentage of your portfolio, and again, they help you both with the portfolio and with your financial planning. So to me, is there a right way? No. The key is to make sure that you understand, one, how they're compensated and how that works, and two, that they're helping you get to the place that you want to go, which is your goals and developing your plan to get there. All right, I'll shut up.
Okay, I don't think we had any other questions from our friends on Facebook or on the chat window. So thank you very much, JJ. For everybody on the call, our next webinar is from Dakowitz, Shaping the Future of Our Service. It's on Monday, December 14th. During the session, General Wolfenberger, chairperson of the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, will share a brief overview of the organization, which was established in 1951. And we'll hear about how their policies are shaping women's rights in the military today. So we look forward to that next webinar in a couple of weeks.
All right, thanks for having me again.
If you haven't joined to become...
Whoa, sorry, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're welcome.
I was just going to say thank you to everybody. Now I'll shut up. Thanks, Mariella.
All right. Well, if you haven't become an SSLA member, we definitely encourage you to join us. You can go to cleader.org to join, and we want you to join because you'll get discounted registration to our annual Joint Women's Leadership Symposium, which is actually going to be held in person next year. So we look forward to everyone joining and as an SSLA member. You can engage with us through various social media websites. We're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter and Instagram, and we also have our website up front for everybody to check us out. And then lastly, again, we're excited to announce that the Joint Women's Leadership Symposium and Career and Transition Seminar is scheduled for 2021, 31 August to 2 September in Norfolk, Virginia at the Marriott there. And again, lastly, thank you, JJ, and thank you everybody that's on the call on Facebook and on Zoom with us today. The Sea Service Leadership Association thanks you for your dedication to helping us fulfill our vision of empowering women, a network of strong and inspirational women leaders who serve. And lastly, before we sign off, happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, JJ.
All right, thank you guys. Happy Thanksgiving.